Chairperson, friends, peace be with you. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this talk for making this possible. My wife and I are very pleased to be with you here this evening. The topic of our discussion this evening is the American Empire, globalization, war, and religion. It is perhaps appropriate that someone from Asia should talk about the American Empire, for the American Empire was born in Asia. It was born on the 6th of August, 1945. It was born on the day that the United States of America decided to drop the atom bomb on Hiroshima. It was born on a day when almost 170,000 human beings were obliterated from the face of the earth. By dropping that bomb, the United States announced to the world that it was the planet's most preeminent power. The unsurpassed superpower of the age. The United States sought to shape the world according to its vision of what the world should be immediately after the war. It set up the United Nations, where the United States had the veto, and 4 other nations, who were all its allies at that time, had the veto. It helped to establish the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the World Bank, and even before the war had ended, the organization called GATT, the predecessor of the WTO. In other words, the United States was going to create an international order where it would be dominant. But then a couple of events happened in 1949, which in a sense thwarted the dream of Washington. In 1949, the Soviet Union, an ally of the United States in the war, decided to invade various parts of Eastern Europe, right up to East Germany. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe, to use the phrase of Winston Churchill. That was a momentous event. There was a challenge to American power. Something else happened in 1949. In October 1949, the Chinese Revolution took place. China, again an ally in the Second World War, became a foe. Communism emerged as a challenge to American dominance. And for the next 40 years, we were witnesses to the Cold War. The Cold War saw not just communism challenging American dominance, but also yet another phenomenon, which turned out to be even more formidable, a phenomenon called nationalism. A number of new states emerged after the Second World War, independent, sovereign, assertive, conscious of their place on earth. These states were not prepared to lose their independence. And at times, communism intertwined with nationalism, as it happened in the case of Vietnam. because the Vietnamese movement was primarily a nationalist movement which had a communist orientation. And that was a challenge to the United States of America. In fact, the only real defeat that the superpower had suffered was in Vietnam. There were other challenges to the empire. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was also in a sense a challenge to OPEC. Again, an attempt by newly emerging countries to mobilize their own resources and protect their own resources, something which the empire was not happy about. But in spite of these challenges, the United States triumphed in the Cold War for a number of reasons. It triumphed because from the end of the Second World War, right up to this day, American economic power began to expand. The multinational corporations were a very important vehicle for the expansion of American economic power. This was accompanied by the expansion of American media power, a very important source of influence and dominance. Equally important was expansion of American entertainment power. Again, a very important source of influence, shaping people's minds. And this happened over a number of decades. So the United States, in the midst of all these challenges, from the newly independent states, from the communist states, remained powerful. At the same time, the communist states were emasculated in different ways. They were emasculated through their own internal rivalries. One very big blow to communism was the Sino-Soviet clash, which began in 1956. It weakened the communist camp. Communist states were not able to deliver the goods, especially to the changing class structure in their respective societies. The working class had expanded, the middle class had arisen, and communist states could not go beyond providing basic needs of their people. This is one of their failings. There was political repression. There was cultural inertia. There was social drabness in these states. The newly independent states also had their share of failures. There was corruption, abuse of power, political repression in a number of states. And there were also rivalries between these newly independent states. And one of those conflicts which dealt a mortal blow to the solidarity of these newly emerging states was the Iran-Iraq war, which weakened OPEC considerably. It weakened the non-aligned movement. It weakened the Organization of Islamic Countries. So you had a situation where, partly because of its own strength, and partly because of the weaknesses of its rivals, of its adversaries, the United States emerged triumphant. The Cold War ended in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed, which was one of the most phenomenal events in history. In 1991, the United States went to war in the same year, 1991, in the Gulf. It scored a stunning victory in the Gulf War. Through that victory, it reasserted a fundamental dictum of empire: the control of resources must remain in the hands of the empire. which is what the Gulf War was all about. An American historian described the Gulf War and its underlying motive in 3 words. He said the Gulf War is about oil, oil, oil. That's what the Gulf War was all about. And if one looks at the pattern that unfolded after that, you would see that the control of resources, of oil in particular, was vital to Washington. Whatever the other motives behind the war in Afghanistan, in the year 2001, there's no doubt at all that oil was also a factor. Not oil in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan does not have any oil, but access to oil-producing states around Afghanistan, the whole Central Asian region. A number of states which are very rich in oil. In fact, oil analysts will tell you that Caspian Sea oil from the Central Asian region, would equal oil from Saudi Arabia in the year 2010. It's a huge oil-producing belt. And then you have the Iraq War, which is also related to oil. The weapons of mass destruction were actually the weapons of mass distraction. It was an attempt to distract people from the real goal, the real motive, and the real motive was oil. It's not just control over resources. Empire is also about defending and perpetuating a particular ideology. Washington has become deeply wedded to the ideology of the Washington Consensus. And what is that ideology of the Washington Consensus? Meaning by which the Treasury, Wall Street, and various business interests linked to Wall Street. It is the pursuit of the American version of capitalism. And what is that version of capitalism? It is liberalization, deregulation, and privatization on a massive scale. It is ensuring the triumph of capital in its rawest form. This is what American capitalism is all about. And its adversary is not just other ideologies, whether it's communism or various variants of socialism or Islam or what have you. Its rivals would include other forms of capitalism. European capitalism, for instance, would be a rival. Capitalism shaped to some extent by welfarism and humanitarian concerns. East Asian capitalism would also be a rival because that's capitalism driven by the state, shaped by the state. That is also a rival, which is why you will see that in the last couple of decades, the United States has targeted other forms of capitalism. Europe has been persuaded to privatize, to deregulate, to liberalize, to dismantle its welfare institutions. And East Asian capitalism suffered a major setback in the 1997-1998 financial crisis, which some economists would argue was manipulated in order to weaken another approach to capitalism. So the whole purpose of this exercise is to ensure that a particular type of capitalism is ascendant, that it's dominant. This is also related to militarism, war, and violence. In order to maintain this sort of capitalism, you need military strength. And military strength that played a very big role in perpetuating the American version of capitalism. Let us just reflect on some of the things we have talked about. Afghanistan, A war takes place. It's the expansion of bases after that. Bases in 5 Central Asian republics. Before that, the Gulf War. A war takes place. The victor establishes bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. Iraq, there are a number of bases in Iraq today. So military bases are very much part of the pattern. And maintaining military dominance is fundamental to this imperialism, as it has been to past imperialisms. You have to maintain your military ascendancy. And for the United States today, this is a major goal. It spends $400 billion a year on the military. This is its military budget. $2 trillion over the next 5 years. It has hundreds of bases all over the world, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. In just 2 countries, South Korea and Japan, it has a total of 100,000 soldiers. And Okinawa in Japan is virtually an American colony. This is imperial power. Now, when you reflect on this, you have to ask yourselves, what does this imperial power mean? Because war and violence is central to the maintenance and perpetuation of power, we would regard this as the most horrendous consequence of empire. Because this means that lives are lost all the while. People are killed. Human dignity is trampled upon. We know that after the end of the Second World War, millions of human beings had been killed in a number of wars connected with the Cold War. Of course, the Soviet Union was also responsible for these deaths. But after the end of the Cold War, the killing fields continue. Military budgets continue to expand. Arms sales continue to expand. It is amazing that in 1997, 6 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States military expenditure had actually gone up, though there was no rival on the horizon, but the obsession with militarism was still there. And because it impacts upon human lives, it is to concern all of us. There are other dimensions of empire that we should be concerned about. Political unilateralism is a dimension of empire that we should also be concerned about. Wanting to act alone, according to one's own whims and fancies, not caring for the rest of the world. Very little regard for the Committee of Nations, whether it is the Kyoto Accord or the International Criminal Court, otherwise known as the Rome Statute, or issues which go back to a couple of decades ago, Antarctica, the law of the seas. This desire, this determination to act alone. And you see it in other areas. The militarization of outer space. Though this has earned the ire of a number of European countries, allies of the United States of America, Washington has decided to go ahead with this very expensive project, the militarization of outer space. And the Iraq War, in spite of all the opposition, decided to go ahead. This is political unilateralism at its worst. And of course, political unilateralism also means that you manipulate international institutions when it suits your convenience. The UN President Bush pronounced on the eve of the war was irrelevant. Now it's relevant because he wants the UN to help the United States. There are other aspects of empire which would concern us. The economic dimensions we have alluded to, but look at its human costs. What does this sort of imperialism, this sort of capitalism driven by deregulation and privatization, what does it mean to human beings? This is what we should ask. Isn't it amazing that with the growth of this type of capitalism, the gap between the have-a-lot and the have-a-little has widened considerably? We're not talking of the old dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots. We're talking about a new dichotomy between the have-a-lot and the have-a-little of this world. In 1960, the gap between the top 20% and the bottom 20% on a global scale was 30 times. By the year 2000, according to UN figures, it had increased to more than 90 times. And this is connected with the type of capitalism that is being pursued. Isn't it a shame, friends, that one human being, one of the richest persons on earth, his total annual income is more than that of the whole of Africa? Isn't it a pity that three of the richest persons on earth, and they're all men, their total earnings exceed that of 48 of the poorest nations on earth? The other day at one of the UN meetings, it was disclosed that the European Union spends more on a cow per annum than what most of the citizens of sub-Saharan Africa earn in a year. These are just statistics for us, but for those who are at the receiving end, you can imagine what these statistics mean. The suffering, the indignity, the marginalization caused by this economic system, which had promised to lift all the boats, which is what globalization is supposed to mean, except that we know that a lot of the boats are sinking. And some are rising very, very fast above the waves. Because I suppose this is in line with that old dictum of that old colonial empire, Britannia rules the waves. I suppose now Pax Americana rules the waves. This is the end result of the type of globalization that we are witnessing. There are yet other aspects that we should look at. The cultural dimension. It is true that empire and this drive towards globalization have not been able to obliterate the cultural variety, which is humankind's heritage. It's true that variety is there, the diversity is still there. But there is a challenge, and the challenge comes from the homogenizing dimension of a global culture. And that global culture is essentially American. It is powerful. It's able to penetrate the sanctum sanctorum, the innermost areas of almost every other culture and civilization. It transforms values, attitudes, relationships within the family, in the community. It promotes a type of individualism, a crass, gross form of individualism, which negates communitarian values, which undermines the sense of sharing, of caring, that have been part of human civilization for such a long while. Friends, does this mean that there is no saving grace in this empire, in the globalization that we are witnessing, which is part of the economic ideology of this empire? It would be wrong to say that there is no saving grace, because empires have also generated some good. This is the historical evidence. The Roman Empire was responsible for developing a set of laws which lasted centuries. It developed an infrastructure, a highway system, which was the marvel of the world. And the American Empire has also got some tremendous achievements in the area of information and communication technology, for instance. And even if you look at growth, growth has, without any doubt at all, contributed towards the alleviation of poverty in certain circumstances, because it does have that sort of impact in certain circumstances. There are countries that have benefited from the expansion of trade driven by empire. These benefits we have to acknowledge. And within the empire itself, you cannot deny that there is some space for dissent. There are diverse views that are expressed within the empire, and the American Empire has perhaps the distinction of being the most ethnically and culturally diverse empire in history. Almost every community under the sun is here in the United States of America. This tremendous religious diversity and ethnic diversity. The schisms which exist within religions in other parts of the world, those schisms have found a common home in this country. These are the great strengths of the United States of America. But these are strengths that would exist even if the United States was not an empire. And that, I think, is what is important. That the great assets, the great virtues of this civilization would be able to sustain themselves, perpetuate themselves, even if the United States of America did not exercise the military power that it does. Because military power has nothing to do with these great, stupendous accomplishments of this particular civilization. Now let's reflect on this from yet another perspective. This is the concluding part of my talk this evening. What does empire, as we've described it, globalization, war, mean to religion? How is it related to religion? Empire is supported to some extent by certain elements within religion. We know, for instance, that the American Empire, at this particular moment in history, is supported by some elements within the Christian evangelical community who support war, who support the type of predatory globalization that we talked about, who want the empire to grow and expand. The great supporters of the empire, Franklin Graham, Pat Robertson, and individuals of that ilk. They are great supporters of empire. But religion has also produced some of the greatest critiques of empire, the opponents of predatory globalization. They've also come from the womb of religion. In the protest against the war in Iraq, for instance, the churches in Europe, both the Protestant and Catholic churches, played a very big role. If there was any one religious individual who played a major role in trying to dissuade the world to go to war, it was the Pope. We have to acknowledge this because the Pope, as we now know, was instrumental in persuading 3 Catholic countries, the Security Council, not to vote for war. So the churches, leading personalities linked to religion, have also been opponents of war and empire, the way in which it is conceived. And this is true not just of Christianity. It's also true of other religions. If you have people within the Judaic faith who support empire, there are also a lot of people within the Judaic faith who are opposed to empire and dominance. This is also true of the Muslim community. There are Muslim leaders who are supporters of empire because the empire ensures their thrones, like the Muslim leaders, the emirs and the sultans of places like Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain and so on and so forth. They have been supporters of the empire. But the Muslim masses and a number of other Muslim governments were opponents of war and empire. So you have the dichotomy in almost every religious community. There may have been Buddhist leaders who had supported the war, but there were Buddhist movements like the International Network of Engaged Buddhists that was opposed to the war. And there were Hindu groups that were vocal opponents of the war and of empire. But there were some elements within Hindu society that supported the war. Now, this dichotomy within religion is going to be an important factor in the future in shaping international relations and world politics. If I may say this about Islam, since I belong to that religion, there are trends and tendencies within the Muslim world which are both negative and positive as far as this future is concerned. You have fringe groups, and I underline this, fringe groups opposed to empire who feel that the only way of fighting this, the only way of confronting empire is through terror, through violence. Al-Qaeda and other groups that may be affiliated to it would be part of that fringe. The perpetrators of September 11th may be part of this. They may be angry, they may be disillusioned, but they have chosen to express their anger in a violent, vicious manner by resorting to terror. But I want to emphasize this, that they do not represent the majority in the Muslim community. This is not just a pious platitude. This is a reality that one has to understand, because sometimes when you read the media, you get the impression that these are powerful groups that dominate Muslim thinking. They are not. You take just one country as an example, where you have fringe groups of this sort, Indonesia. Indonesia for centuries, and this is the world's most populous Muslim nation, has had an approach and an understanding of Islam that is the epitome of tolerance. A country where 90% of the population is Muslim recognizes all the minority religions as official religions. And as you know, one of the greatest heritages of Buddhist civilization, the Borobudur, is in Indonesia. This is something that is forgotten in the midst of all the din and noise about terrorist groups. Because when I was reading Time magazine on the plane, I looked at this article in Indonesia and I thought to myself, someone who doesn't know Indonesia would conclude that the place is infested with the Jamaah Islamiyah types, that you have Amrozis and Imam Samudras and individuals of that sort all over the Republic. This is not true at all. But the point remains that there is a fringe element, which is a matter of concern. But you have that fringe element in other religions too. Within Hindutva, you have a fringe element that believes in violence. Even within a religion like Buddhism, if you look at the Sri Lankan conflict, we have had Buddhist monks advocating violence directed against the Tamil minority. And of course, within Christianity, those who support dominance and hegemony, they have no compunctions about going to war. So you have this phenomenon in all religions, this tendency towards violence and terror. There's something else within religious communities that should concern us. Again, groups and individuals are very concerned about hegemony, empire, dominance, especially its cultural dimension. They react to it. But how do they react to it? They react to it by emphasizing an atavistic vision of religion, wanting to go back to the past, a revivalist notion of religion, a religion that is wrapped in a literal interpretation of texts. You find that among Muslims, you find that amongst Christians, Jews, Hindus, people of all religious communities. And as far as Islam is concerned, I think thinking Muslims must deal with this. They must come out in the open and say this openly, that this is not right, this is not Islam. Applying one's faith to the here and now means drawing out its principles and values, its standards, not going back to a legalistic, formalistic, literalist interpretation rooted in the past. That's not what it means. We have to take a position on things of this sort. This is where the hope lies for the future. If within each and every religion you have people who can draw out these principles, values, and standards, apply them to the contemporary situation, provide that moral ballast that humanity needs, because that's what spirituality provides us with, that moral ballast, a certain notion of right and wrong, of the larger, higher purpose of life, a certain affinity with the transcendent and the sacred, because these are areas which the modern human being is actually very concerned about, because modernity somehow has not been able to provide answers to issues that really trouble the human being in his or her finite mortal existence. We cannot run away from this. But this doesn't mean a return to the past. It means looking to the future, drawing out these values, working together in a multi-religious, multi-faith environment. And one wants to stress this, that in order to discover the quintessence of our faith, in order to discover what is essential in each of our traditions, you have to work in a multi-faith, multi-religious environment, because that compels you to think of the other. It compels you to understand the other. And the other appears in different forms. The other appears in the form of gender. The other appears in the form of another religious community, cultural community, another nation. And this is why understanding the other is so important for the present in this age of ours. And we have to work this out within this multi-faith, multi-religious environment. It is a momentous task. It is something that will take a long, long while, but it has begun. I want to draw some examples from my part of the world in conclusion to show that there are reasons for hope. Take Indonesia. a multi-religious country, where you have huge, powerful Islamic groups with millions and millions of members. There are two of them, for instance, which one may want to take note of: the Nahdlatul Ulama and the Muhammadiyah, one with a membership of 40 million and the other with a membership of 35 million, the largest social movements in the Muslim world. And what is their position on the role of religion and spirituality in the contemporary world? They argue without inhibition that religion in the contemporary world means drawing out its eternal principles and values, which are universal, which apply to all human beings. It doesn't mean imposing a certain set of laws from one religion upon the rest of society. They've taken positions against that sort of approach to Islam. Religion means, according to them, communicating with the others and discovering what is in common with other faiths, while respecting one's differences, which will always be there. And this is the position of a number of other groups in Southeast Asia. The Buddhists, who are active, who are engaged in social transformation, take similar positions. So do the Christians in the Philippines. So do Hindu groups in various parts of Southeast Asia. This is what provides us with hope. In a very multi-religious part of the world, you have people reaching out to one another. I've always felt in the marrow of my bones that this is the new civilization that is waiting to be born. And it will be born, though we may not be there to welcome the birth of this new civilization. But there's something that we must do. We must all work towards its success. Thank you very much. What is unique about this empire, apart from what we had talked about earlier in the lecture itself? I would argue that no empire in the post-colonial period, in this present age, can last very long. That's the consolation. I don't think this empire is going to last. I wouldn't want to predict how long it will last, but I don't think it's going to be there forever. No empire has been there forever, but even in terms of its lifespan, I think its lifespan is going to be much, much shorter than many other empires in the past. Why do I say this? In the post-colonial period, nation-states are very conscious of sovereignty and independence. To understand this, we just have to look at the situation in Iraq today. The mainstream media can continue telling us that these are the remnant elements from the Saddam regime who are doing the killings and so on, but I don't think this is the whole truth. There may be those remnants that are involved, but this is basically resistance from people who don't want to be occupied, because like human beings everywhere, they value their own independence and sovereignty. It's as simple as that. Robert Fisk, one of the finest journalists, writing on the Middle East, you know, this British journalist who works for The Independent, before the war ended, he had predicted that this would happen. He had said, look, this occupation is not going to work. All you have to do, and he was writing as a Britisher, all you have to do is look at an earlier occupation when Britain occupied Iraq. There was resistance. And it's very interesting that when the British general who entered Baghdad in 1932, when he made his victory speech, he said, we come here to Mesopotamia. You know, at that time, that was the term that was used. We come here to Mesopotamia not as invaders, but as liberators. Exactly the same words as Blair and Bush. We come as liberators. And we are here to restore the greatness of your culture. And this was a reference to the Ottoman Empire and how the Ottomans had suppressed the Arabs. And this is what he had said. And as Robert Fisk points out, what happened in the ensuing years? We had 30,000 graves of British soldiers littered all over Iraq. That's the resistance. And today it's beginning to happen. Every day, I think just this morning, my wife and I were listening to television. I think there were another 2 persons killed at the UN office. And this, I think, is going to go on. which I think is very, very unfortunate, because these are young people who are participating in a war which has no meaning for them. They're just used as cannon fodder, because you've got a cabal in Washington, the new cons, as they are called, people who have a certain vision of empire, of redoing the map of the Middle East and controlling the world and all the rest of it. I think this is the problem. I don't think this sort of vision would last, partly because of the post-colonial situation, and also because, let's not forget, today, 2003, you are dealing with a world that is also very conscious about democracy and freedom, and the United States of America has unwittingly contributed towards this. It has made people very aware of this, why it's so important to uphold democracy, freedom, and the United States presents itself as a nation which cherishes freedom and democracy. Now, you can't be doing both these things. You can't be an empire on the one hand and be the champion of freedom and democracy in the other. It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction. You're either an empire or you are a defender of democracy and freedom. And I think in this sort of situation, the United States will not be able to play the role of empire for very long. There are other factors linked to the domestic situation. If the economy doesn't improve, if there are more and more criticisms of cutbacks in various sectors of the economy, if more and more people feel left out, alienated, if the unemployment situation gets worse. I read a report the other day that said that the official figure of 8 million unemployed is an underestimate. It's closer to 12 million. If it's closer to 12 million, then I think it's quite serious. And this doesn't include people who work as consultants and, who do all sorts of other things. These are hidden forms of unemployment or underemployment. The situation is, I think, quite serious. And look at the national debts. It's the largest debtor nation on earth. It's a very, very difficult situation. If the killings continue in Iraq, the economy doesn't improve, and if President Bush is challenged by a credible candidate who knows more about defense and security than he does, he may be in trouble. He may be in trouble. So I don't think this is going to last very long, and we will all be around, I think, to celebrate the end of empire. I think so.
Can you comment on the recent failure of the WTO meetings in Cancun?
Thank you very much. I was traveling when Cancun happened, so it's snippets and newspaper items, television reports, and so on. But the events leading to Cancun, we had kept abreast with some of those things. It was undoubtedly, if you look at its outcome, it was undoubtedly a victory for third world countries and for the poor. Because if Cancun had succeeded, meaning by which if they had managed to do what they wanted, the rich and powerful, the European Union, Japan, the United States of America, because they wanted the Singapore issues agenda to be passed at Cancun. And what was this agenda? Various issues that were not resolved at the Singapore meeting. And these were issues connected with investment, trade, procurement, facilitation, and other related issues. They were hoping that at Cancun all these things would be resolved. The third world countries would open up their service sector, open up their banks, get rid of all the sort of differentials between domestic investors and foreign investors. They wanted all these things to happen. But none of these things could be discussed because third world countries, spearheaded by Brazil, India, and China, insisted that the question of agricultural subsidies should be resolved first. They wanted the rich countries to get rid of their subsidies, and the subsidies were huge, something like $300 billion. This is the value of the subsidies. And because of these subsidies, the poor are suffering. Poor countries are flooded with products from the rich countries, agricultural products. It could be cotton, it could be milk, it could be olive oil, it could be all sorts of things. They're just flooded with these products. They have no way of withstanding this. Their own people are out of jobs. Whole farms have closed down. Literally thousands and thousands of people have had to return to their villages. People have lost their jobs in the cities. All these things have happened as a result of this unfair subsidization of agricultural products from the rich countries. So I'm glad that they put up a fight. Governments joined hands with NGOs. I think Sister Jean was there. She's one of the soldiers who's returned from Cancun, triumphant. And the resistance was amazing from what I've read and from what I've heard from her yesterday. And I hope this will continue. Some people are saying, I've seen a couple of features on Cancun, they're saying that this is a turning point. Why? Because since the mid-70s, when third world countries were united in demanding a new international economic order in 1974, they were united on a couple of other major issues like the new international information order and so on. Since then, third world solidarity has fizzled out. But now for the first time, that solidarity has come back. And I suspect that this is due to a man by the name of George Bush, that they have become more united. I mean, this is his role in history. He's contributing towards this, uniting people, bringing various forces together. I mean, who else has succeeded as much as George Bush in uniting the disenfranchised and the dispossessed of the world? They've all come together because of him. Because of him. His unilateralism is so blatant that people have come together. It's just amazing. This is a tremendous achievement. He has united the whole of humankind. This, I think, is also something that has to be discussed. You're right that there is a certain degree of demonization of Muslims in certain countries, in certain parts of the world. There are many ways of explaining this. If you analyzed this phenomenon historically, you'll find that this has been happening for a long while. There is a whole history behind this sort of demonization. I hope to talk about it at greater length in one of the talks in the Boston area. Someone has asked me to speak on Islam in the West. I think it's at Tufts, on Islam in the West. But they're just these 3 points one would like to make very quickly, since this very important question has come at the end. The first point is this, that there is a certain history, as I said, behind this demonization. And that's connected with the Crusades, with the occupation of parts of Europe by Muslim civilization at different points in history. It's connected with colonialism. And in recent times, it is connected with oil, without any doubt at all. You look at the book that Edward Said wrote many years ago called Orientalism, which became a classic, 1978. And then later he wrote this book called Covering Islam, where he says that the demonization of Islam in the popular media began with the nationalization of oil in a number of Muslim countries. And some of these people who nationalized oil were not even Islamic in that sense, meaning by which they were not very devout Muslims. The outstanding example that comes to my mind is Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran in 1953, very secular leader, nationalized oil, very, very popular leader. The Americans didn't like it. They got rid of him and strengthened the position of the Shah. And of course, eventually the Shah fell in 1979. So the point one is making is that oil has played a role in this. And I think since 1948, but more so after 1967, the whole question of Israel is also linked with the demonization of Islam in the media, which I think is very, very unfortunate, because historically, Muslims and Jews have had very good relations. This is something that is not often talked about, but this is the historical record. But because of Israel, and because of the whole question of Israel and the war in Palestine, a certain degree of demonization has taken place in the media. So there are, I think, reasons behind this. And today, it is September 11th, the fear syndrome that has developed, and you're right. People have complained about how Muslims are treated at checkpoints and at the immigration and so on. Both my wife and I were a little apprehensive when we came in, because we were coming in from Malaysia after a stop in Beirut, in Lebanon. And we were wondering how they would treat us at the airport. But it was a breeze. They were very nice, and we had no problems at all. And I was talking to a friend of mine who had traveled quite extensively within the United States of America, a Muslim, 2 months ago. And he was saying that he didn't encounter any problems. But there are also stories about people encountering problems and so on, which may or may not be true. It may be exaggerated. It may not be exaggerated. We don't know. But according to this Muslim organization called CAIR, C-A-I-R, I think you've heard of this organization. It's very active in Washington. I think it is the Committee for American Islamic Relations, CAIR. It's an active advocacy group. Now, that group has alleged that Islamophobia has become much more serious after September 11th. You know, this whole thing about Islam as a threat, as an enemy, and so on. This is where we need interfaith communication. It's very, very important. We have to strengthen one another. We have to give confidence to one another. And I've always advocated this, the importance of Muslims understanding the West, and I'm using these terms in very general sense, and the importance of the West understanding Muslims. I think this is very, very critical. One should not generalize. That is the first prerequisite for better understanding. You should not generalize about any civilization, because in all civilizations you will find different types of people. If one wants to talk about violence and terror and all the rest of it, it wouldn't be right to generalize about Christianity just because of the Crusades or because of the Inquisition or because of the genocide in the Americas. One can't say this is what Christianity is. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his book, The Discovery of India, says that he can never accept that the imperialism and the brutality of Western imperialism, sometimes linked to Christianity, because, the imperialists also said that they were going forth in the name of Christianity. He could never ever accept that this was the religion that the gentle soul of Nazareth had preached. There's no way you can link it with Jesus. Similarly, I don't think one can say that Osama bin Laden represents Islam. He represents himself. But he doesn't represent Islam. There are millions and millions of Muslims who were ashamed of what he had done. And in that connection, let me also stress this point, that when September 11th happened, some of the most radical denunciations actually came from Muslim theologians. And I was watching CNN, at least CNN as it's broadcast in my part of the world. They did not carry any of those denunciations of September 11th. The most famous theologian in the Muslim world is a man by the name of Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi. On the 12th of September, he issued a statement saying that this is a shameful, heinous deed, which has no place in Islam, but that was not carried. And I find that the mainstream Western media sometimes tends to do this. You see, that they give much more emphasis to voices which don't represent Islam because it fits a particular stereotype. But the moderates, those who are the thinking types, they are sidelined. This is something that has to change.